The tide had already turned when Eli Marsh dragged the last lobster trap up from the rocks, its wire frame rusted through, its rope gone brittle and gray. Down at the harbor, the men on the dock stopped mending their nets just long enough to watch him load it onto his truck. "There he goes again," one of them said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Collecting junk nobody else wants." Except it wasn't junk to Eli. For 4 months, he'd been driving the coast road from Stone Point to Harker's Cove, knocking on doors, asking fishermen if he could haul away their broken traps, their torn nets, their split buoys. He never explained why. He just asked, loaded his truck, and drove back toward the one piece of land nobody in 3 counties believed could be saved. If you love stories about quiet stubbornness and people who see a future where everyone else sees ruin, stay with me to the end and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And also, if this kind of story hits you the same way it hit me, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. It helps more than you'd think. Eli's father, Tom Marsh, had run the family's cranberry bog for 31 years before the stroke took him in his sleep. Eli was 26, and until that morning the bog had never once been his responsibility. He'd grown up wading through the flooded rows every October, harvesting the deep red berries as they floated to the surface, but he'd never learned the part that mattered most, how to keep the ocean out. Because that was the thing nobody outside the family understood. The Marsh bog sat low, hugging a barrier dune that separated it from the Atlantic by less than 60 yards. For 3 decades, that dune had held, but 2 winters of brutal nor'easters had chewed it down to almost nothing, and the insurance adjuster who walked the property after Tom's funeral didn't bother softening his words. "One more storm surge," he said, "and this whole bog is salt water. Salt would kill the vines in a single season. Cranberries don't survive the ocean. They survive because of the wall that keeps it out." Eli could have sold. A developer named Grant Pelham had already made 2 offers on the property, both generous, both delivered with the kind of smile that assumed the answer was obvious. Waterfront land was worth more empty than it was worth as a dying farm. Everyone in town expected Eli to take the money and let the bog go the way the dune already had. Instead, he started driving. Every morning before the tide came in, he loaded his truck and went from harbor to harbor, asking fishermen for their broken gear. Most said yes, it cost them nothing to hand over garbage they were paying to dispose of anyway. A few looked at him sideways and said no, uneasy about a grieving young man who wanted their trash and wouldn't say what for. He thanked them anyway and drove to the next dock. By the 2nd month, his palms had split open from the wire and the salt-stiffened rope. But the truck bed kept filling. At the Coombs wharf, old Denny Coombs watched Eli stack broken traps into the truck and shook his head. "Son, if you need lumber, I've got scrap wood behind the shed." "I don't need lumber," Eli said. "I need the traps, the ones already falling apart." Denny didn't understand it, and neither did half the harbor, who started telling anyone who'd listened that Tom Marsh's boy had lost his mind out there, dragging garbage onto a bog that was already half dead. But Eli kept a notebook, his father's old logbook, salt-stained and held together with electrical tape, and in it he wrote down where the dune sand shifted after every tide, where the marsh grass still clung on despite the erosion, where the wind hit hardest during a storm. He was reading that shoreline the way you'd read a wound, slowly, trying to understand exactly where it was bleeding. By late spring he had built 4 long, low ridges running parallel to the shrinking dune, each one framed with old trapwire staked into the sand and packed with woven rope, broken buoys, and brush from the tree line. From a distance, they looked like fences that had already given up. "He's building something out there," Denny's wife told the whole church potluck. "I don't want to know what it's for." Nobody asked Eli directly, and true to form, he never offered an explanation. He just kept building. What he was actually building had a name, though nobody on that stretch of coast had heard it spoken out loud in years. His father had mentioned it to him once, half asleep in a hospital chair the week before he died. A method the old Wampanoag families along that shoreline had used generations before the Marsh family ever bought the land. Brush and debris weighted low against the dune, not to stop the waves, but to slow them, to trap drifting sand instead of letting it wash back out to sea with every tide. Eli hadn't thought about that conversation in months. Grief has a strange way of handing old words back to you exactly when you need them most. The first ridge failed within 3 weeks. A spring storm tore straight through the loosely staked wire, scattering broken buoys across the bog like debris from a shipwreck. Eli stood in the rain and looked at the wreckage of 2 months' work, and for the first time since the funeral, he sat down right there in the wet sand and didn't move for a long while. Then he got up and rebuilt it, angling the framework this time so incoming waves would lose their force before they ever reached the dune itself. That wasn't the last setback. A second storm in April ripped the brush cover clean off another ridge, leaving the bare wire exposed like the ribs of something long dead. Eli spent 3 days repacking it by hand. A few weeks later, gulls tore apart the marsh grass he'd transplanted along the base, forcing him to weave a denser barrier from trap rope just to keep the birds off. Each time, he rebuilt. Each time, and a few more people in town watched him do it and said nothing, because nothing about it looked like it was working. One afternoon, a coastal engineer from the state university pulled off the road to study the eroding dunes along that stretch of coast, and instead found Eli's ridges. He walked the length of them without speaking, then asked if Eli had studied shoreline restoration somewhere. Eli told him no from a story, nearly lost, that his father gave him too late to ask any follow-up questions. The engineer didn't laugh. He nodded slowly and said he'd seen something similar documented once, on an old survey from a shoreline that had somehow outlasted a hurricane that flattened everything around it. It was the first time anyone outside Eli's own head had told him he wasn't chasing a dead man's fantasy. That same spring, once the ridges finally held their shape, Eli planted young dune grass directly into the trapped sand behind them, thin, pale shoots that looked like they wouldn't survive the first hard wind, let alone a season. He scattered beach pea seed around the base of each ridge, something to hold the loose sand together while new roots found their grip. By midsummer, the beach pea had greened in low along the ridgeline. The grass itself was still sparse, still unconvincing. To anyone driving past, it looked like sand with weeds on it. But underneath, something was happening that nobody could see yet. The first summer passed without incident. Then came the fall everyone in 3 counties still talks about. A hurricane that had weakened over open water suddenly re-strengthened 40 miles offshore, and by the time it made landfall, it was pushing a storm surge higher than anything the harbor had recorded in 20 years. 2 waterfront properties past the Coombs place lost their docks entirely. The Pelham development site, the one Grant Pelham had already cleared and graded for construction, lost nearly 30 feet of exposed shoreline in a single night. By every reasonable expectation, Eli's dune, barely a year into recovery, propped up by garbage and grass, should have failed first. It didn't. It was Denny Coombs who noticed, driving the coast road at first light to check the damage to his own property. He pulled over at the marsh bog and just stood there. The ridges had held. Sand had piled up thick against the wire and brush exactly where Eli had staked it, and behind that barrier, the bog sat untouched, the vines dark green and dry. Everywhere else along that shoreline, the storm had rearranged the coastline overnight. Here it looked like nothing had happened at all. "How?" Denny said. Not really a question. Eli walked out to meet him, salt wind pulling at his jacket. "The traps," he said. "They were never garbage out there. They were a wall, waiting to happen." Denny didn't fully understand it that morning, but he came back the next week, and the week after that. And eventually he stopped pretending he was just passing by. Word travels slowly along a quiet coast, and slower still when pride's involved. It took most of that fall for people to stop calling Eli reckless and start calling him lucky, as if luck could explain a 1-year-old dune outlasting a hurricane that had gutted shoreline twice its age. It wasn't luck. It was one hard spring of gathering, 4 ruined ridges rebuilt by hand, and a willingness to be laughed at for exactly as long as it took to be right. By the following year, the bog didn't just survive. It produced the heaviest cranberry harvest the Marsh family had seen in over a decade, the vines thriving now that saltwater wasn't creeping in with every high tide. People came at first out of curiosity, driving slow past the ridgeline to see it for themselves. Then they came with questions. Then eventually, they came with their own broken traps, asking if Eli still needed gear or if he'd walk them through how to build a ridge of their own. He said yes to all of it. Grant Pelham never made a third offer. He didn't need to ask why. By the second harvest, boats from 3 counties over were dropping off old gear at the Marsh property instead of paying to dump it. And Eli's ridges had grown into a shoreline that state engineers now used as a case study for towns further up the coast. What people remembered, in the years after, wasn't really the harvest. Bogs come and go with enough rain and enough tide. What they remembered was a young man who had every reason to sell and walk away, and instead spent a year gathering what everyone else had thrown out, then waited for a storm to prove he'd been right all along. He never said, "I told you so." He didn't have to. The dune said it for him, every time the tide came in, and simply stayed where it belonged. Somewhere beneath all that grass and sand, buried where no one could see it, were the same broken traps people had laughed at him for collecting, quietly holding the line, quietly doing exactly what he always believed they would. It turns out the difference between wreckage and a wall was never in the wire at all. It was in who was patient enough to wait for what it could become.